This is TVCL, and welcome to the Practically True podcast. Hedonism is the ruling ethical theory of the modern world that nobody knows the name of, yet most people plan for, work for, and generally base all of their decisions around. And so, what is hedonism? If you are a hedonist, you believe happiness is the meaning of life, that a life best lived is one that you enjoy as much as possible. That's pretty intuitive, is it not? At the end of the day, when we think that life is about money, or success, or power, or finding the right job, or finding the right relationship, when it comes down to it, people just want to be happy. What could be wrong with this idea? The first thing to note is that the argument being made here is not that happiness is bad, and that everyone should mope around being miserable for the whole of their lives. The argument will be that hedonism is bad, that regarding happiness as the core and highest purpose of your life is bad, and this is for two reasons. The first reason is that hedonism actually makes life less enjoyable. Even if you wanted to be as happy as possible, it actually turns out that pursuing happiness directly has the ironic effect of making it harder to get, much like trying to hold a bar of soap as hard as you can, making it slip through your fingers. Instead, it's better to prioritize other things and hold happiness with a light grip. The second reason is that there are demonstrably things that are more important in life. If happiness really is of the utmost importance, we would find that life is unanimously not worth living without it. Yet, we find that people persist in living despite a complete lack of happiness. What's more, we find people who are willing to accept the direct opposite of happiness, who are willing to accept suffering and death to do things that we would consider moral. If this is the case, we would have to ask, what makes happiness so important if it can be sacrificed for something else? Let's look at the first reason more closely. Pursuing happiness actually decreases your level of happiness. Why is this? One reason is because it accentuates your misery. Think of it this way. If happiness is the most important thing in life, any time spent being unhappy is wasted time. Any time you're not being happy, you're not doing the thing that your whole life is meant to be for. How depressing. Simply put, being unhappy can make you unhappy about being unhappy. Because if happiness really is regarded as so valuable, its loss deals an even harsher blow. What's worse, a hedonist is less able to face up to hardship. If happiness is the meaning of life, there is less meaning to sustain us in life when that meaning is lacking. Meaning gives us vitality and strengthens our will. If happiness is the meaning itself, whenever we are unhappy, that strength will be sapped from us. Hard times are those when we need our strength the most, but hard times are also the least happy. And so, if happiness is the meaning of life, during such time we will have even less strength to get through the very things that are making us miserable. Also, happiness tends to degrade with increased consumption. True enough, this might not be applicable to every hue of happiness, such as joy, fulfillment, or peace, but it's certainly applicable to pleasure. We become calloused to our pleasures through indulgence. Just think about how a piece of music might be very enjoyable the first or second time you hear it, but very unenjoyable if you play it 100 times in a single day. Or think about how the meal that was delicious on the Monday becomes almost sickening by the second Friday. If you chase happiness through pleasure, you will never be satisfied. you will always be looking for more games, more food, more drugs, more exciting holidays, more interesting music, more sexual partners, more money, maybe even more power, until it all becomes stale and you're back to being miserable. This is why hedonism, in its basic form, is closely connected to greed and debauchery. Indeed, this cascades onto another point about why hedonism is so pernicious. What are we willing to trade for it? And, more to the point, where does it make us stand in the face of evil? Think this through for a moment. Let's say that a man lives next to an estate where human trafficking takes place. If happiness is genuinely, ultimately, the highest goal of this man's life, what should he do? After all, confronting the fact, merely realizing it, would be very uncomfortable and disturb whatever peaceful bubble he might have been in. And that's to say nothing of trying to do anything about it. If the man is happily unaware, we would conclude that he should remain so. After all, the traffickers pose no harm to him. He can carry on with his life. Yes, they might be abusing children, drugging and exploiting women, but if they do nothing to him, what's the issue? His happiness is of primary importance. But, you might say, what if the knowledge of the crimes, coupled with his doing nothing about it, was another form of discomfort that outweighed whatever harm the criminals could do to him? That's not the point. The point is this. If the man had a choice between doing something and taking some kind of drug that allowed him to forget that such a thing as human trafficking ever existed, why would he not take the drug? Indeed, if he were a genuine hedonist and happiness was the ultimate priority, he would have to take the drug. In brief, hedonism is a boon to evil, because people who place happiness above all else are vulnerable to it. If happiness is the meaning of life, all that evil has to do is threaten to take that happiness away, and then it has complete power over you. Of course, this is not to say that happiness is not valuable, even vitally so. As St. Aquinas said, no man can live without joy. Likewise, no man can live without food. Food is vitally important, but we would not conclude from this that the meaning of life is to eat. Instead, it seems that we eat in order to live, and that we live in order to do more important things than simply eating. Happiness is a kind of spiritual food, emotional sustenance. When we are cold, those moments of joy can warm us so that we can go back out to face the cold again. But the campfire on a journey is not as important as the journey itself. Now let's look at the second point more. There are things in life that are clearly more important than happiness if we are only willing to look for them. We could first think of the amount of comfort and happiness parents know that they would be willing to sacrifice for the sake of their children. Or perhaps think about how soldiers have been willing to give up their comfort and their lives for family or king or country. Whether you think that any of these things are important or not, it does show that there are things that people are willing to sacrifice happiness for. Perhaps the starkest examples come from the respective accounts of Viktor Frankl and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Frankl lived through the Nazi death camps, many of which were indistinguishable from hell. An inmate had no food, no hair, almost no clothing, was exposed to the elements and exposed to constant labour and torture. Many inmates didn't even have families, and many had been stripped of their identity. In such an environment, happiness is not on the table. If happiness really were the ultimate meaning of life, you might ask, why didn't every inmate who had not been killed already simply commit suicide? It could be very easy to do so. And indeed, many inmates did. But how do we explain those who didn't? Not only did many inmates decide to live on, but Frankl even describes inmates who, despite their extreme malnourishment, were willing to give away their daily ration of food for the good of others. If happiness were the meaning of life, we would have no way to explain this, because we would have to conclude that no one would be able to find any meaning, to find anything worth living for, let alone be willing to accept even more suffering in the process. Yet they did. People found that life had a meaning worth living and even worth fighting for, whilst living in the cold depths of pain. The other example that makes this so lucid comes from Solzhenitsyn. As a former prisoner of the Soviet concentration camps, he recounts the story of another inmate. This man was assigned to a work team under a Soviet commandant, one of the camp officers. As one of his first jobs, the prisoner was asked to clean the commander's socks. The prisoner refused. Incensed by this refusal, the commander reduced his rations. When he was asked to clean the socks again, the prisoner refused. Incensed a second time, the commandant made sure that the prisoner was subjected to harsher conditions than the rest. And so this went on. All of the other inmates around the prisoner said, "Why don't you do it? It's only a small thing." Yet, for something so small, you're willing to subject yourself to more and more pain. It's easy, trivial. Just clean the man's socks. Yet, despite it all, the prisoner refused. He would not clean the commander's socks. Apparently, there was something about helping an evil man, even in the smallest way, that was worse than all of the pain that he could throw at him. And, therefore, something better for the prisoner about following his conscience than all of the comfort that he could have gained by simply following along. And so, once again, a man found something better than happiness. Indeed, something that he was even willing to embrace pain for in order to live in the way that he thought best. Yet, can we not use the two examples above in defense of happiness? After all, you might ask, wasn't the reason why the prisoner chose to follow his conscience because he knew that not doing so would be too uncomfortable, emotionally or spiritually, in a way that outweighed his physical comfort? And so, the prisoner was actually trying to maximize his happiness. He was simply willing to trade one kind of happiness for another. What about a mother or father who gives their life for their children? Isn't that because they know that living with the knowledge that they didn't save their child would be unbearable? And so, isn't it actually happiness that they're trying to gain by trading a final happy act for a lifetime of misery? And what of those starving inmates who gave their last piece of bread? Despite all the pain, surely there was simply some way in which giving their bread away was more enjoyable than keeping it, even until the very end. And so, doesn't this show that in all of these cases, we can still find examples of how happiness is always our utmost priority and the most important thing in life? Maybe. Viewing happiness in this way appears to require that we either dilute our idea of happiness to the point of being meaningless, or we expand and mature it beyond our current understanding. Why would this be? Because when we spread our definition of happiness to encompass even the willful embrace of pain, we start to remove the idea from our common relation of it to positive feeling. Given our common understanding, it's hard to make sense of someone finding happiness in suffering. And that's not happiness despite suffering, but finding it in the suffering itself. And when we talk about people giving up their lives in order to be happy, we seem to be talking about putting happiness beyond life itself. When we commonly think of happiness as the meaning of life, we commonly think of enjoying the time that we have as much as possible. But if we extend the meaning in the way proposed, we start to talk about suffering through life, and not even for the time we have, but whilst we are actively willing to give that life away. In essence, we would attempt to define our common sense notion with its opposite, utterly diluting its meaning. In light of this, we appear to have two options. We can conclude that happiness simply isn't the meaning of life, and that there are things that stand above it, things that make life worth living and worth fighting for, even when happiness is lacking, and that we would even hand over our happiness to gain. Or we can try to hold on to the idea that happiness is the meaning of life, but if we do so, we would have to broaden and deepen our understanding of happiness far beyond what we currently understand by it. We would have to understand happiness by its embrace of suffering, almost completely transforming it from our common sense notions. I will give you my own thoughts on the matter, because it would be disingenuous to imply that I don't have any. But that's all that they are. Thoughts and beliefs, not proofs. My intuitions tell me that the answer lies somewhere between these two options. That there really are more moral and more meaningful things in life to pursue than our enjoyment of it. It doesn't make sense to say that happiness will be found in this life and in this world. If we really did want to say that all that we do in this life, from suffering to dying, is all for the sake of happiness, then that ultimate purpose would have to be placed somewhere else, to be realized somewhere else. Not in this life, but in the next. And that is if, and only if, happiness truly is the meaning of life. Thank you for your time.